We're coming to you from this is the Golden Ball Tavern Museum that's hosting the event, and our speaker is from the Robbins House. And I'm going to go ahead so that we can get started for our speaker's sake to turn you over to Katie Campbell and let her introduce Jen.
Good evening. Welcome to our lecture series. We are delighted to have Jen Turner with us, the executive director of the Robbins House in Concord. She has been the executive director there for 3 years or 3+ years. She got her undergraduate degree at Bates College and her master's at the University of Connecticut, and she's working on her doctorate at UMass Boston. So she is a history aficionado. She's worked at several Massachusetts-based museums, including Plymouth Plantation, the Paul Revere House, and the Sargent House Museum in Gloucester. She is passionate about her subject, which is the Robbins House, which was originally located on a farm overlooking the Great Meadows along the Concord River. And it was the first two families who lived there were descendants of Caesar Robbins, who was a revolutionary patriot of color. And the house is one of the only known historic sites commemorating the legacy of the previously enslaved Revolutionary War veteran. It has been moved since then to right near the battlefield and Old Manse. I'm sure Jen will tell us more about that. But if you have not been there, I encourage you to visit. It is a fascinating museum with a lot of information about the enslaved from the Revolutionary War to the present. This presentation is made possible through a grant from Mass Humanities and Mass Cultural Council. So we're very grateful to them for their support. And I don't want to say anything that takes away from Jen's interesting information, particularly about Ellen Garrison. And so I will pass it on to Jen and say welcome and thank you for speaking with us this evening.
Thank you, Katie. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I'm going to share my screen. Can everybody see? Yes, okay. So I'm going to hit present. Okay. Can everybody see the screen? Yes. Well, actually, it's a webinar. Katie can. Okay.
I see the screen.
Thank you. Okay. So thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here to talk about the Robbins House as an institution and how we came to be, and then talking a little bit about one of the people who really is part of the really central story that we tell at the Robbins House today, which is Ellen Garrison and her journey as a civil rights activist during Reconstruction. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Robbins House, and then we'll talk a little bit about Ellen Garrison. So the Robbins House has been a museum since 2011, and we tell the lived experiences of African Americans in 19th century Concord. Our museum has really helped to reframe the conversation about what 19th century Concord looked like. The Robbins and Garrison families were part of a community of persons of color living in Concord, and they were really well known to many of the more prominent white counterpart families, such as the Alcotts, the Emersons, and Thoreaus. So really they were contemporaries, on the periphery, but contemporaries of, many of the more famous people that we think about when we think of Concord. But as we like to say at the Robbins House, the Robbins and Garrison family, they really are a Concord family. And the more we uncover about their lives, the more remarkable their story becomes, because it really highlights both Black activism in Massachusetts and beyond. So before I talk a little bit about the lives of the Robbins family members, particularly Ellen Garrison, I think it's really important to take a step back and consider how we as historians and as museum professionals reconstruct the lives of many of these individuals who lived much more marginal lives, literally on the periphery of their communities in many circumstances, than many of their white contemporaries. So Katie and I were actually just talking about this, but we really use a lot of different records to try to uncover and reconstruct the lives of the family members of the occupants of the Robbins House. And it's really not always easy to reconstruct the lives of marginalized people. And it often takes really more sleuthing than we might need for more prominent Concordians. Records are not easily found in many cases, or they don't exist. So records for persons of color, for poor people, for women, don't always exist. And when they do, they're not always complete. So it takes much more guesswork and really using records in different ways to help kind of reclaim these individuals' lives and stories. And these records include things like vital records, genealogical records, overseer of the poor records, deeds, account books. So using, town records, church records, kind of in new and different ways to try to piece together from a lot of disparate sources to develop a much more fuller picture of these marginalized communities that we're trying to tell their stories. And the other thing that I want us to think about and keep in mind as we kind of talk about the Robbins House and also Ellen Garrison is to also think about how the homes and objects of marginalized individuals are used and ultimately preserved. I was at a workshop once in Concord, and the facilitator asked this kind of really interesting question. And he started the workshop by saying this. He said, how many times has Orchard House or the Emerson House been moved, right? In its history as homes, how many times has Orchard House, right, the home of Louisa May Alcott, and the Emerson House, the home of Ralph Waldo Emerson, been moved? And the facilitator's point was that the Robbins House, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, has been moved at least twice in its history. So it's really something to think about when we think about, talking about Black history and kind of the struggle to really kind of capture these stories and to really kind of avoid the erasure of this really important history in Massachusetts and beyond. So let's talk a little bit about the Robbins House itself. So the history of the Robbins House is very interesting. So as Katie mentioned in her introduction, the Robbins House today is in its third location. So its third location, we're located in the back corner lot of the Minuteman National Park near the Old Manse. We're kind of diagonally across the Old Manse. And we're in the parking lot where people get out of their cars to walk to the North Bridge. So we're in a pretty prominent place in Concord now, but this is not where the Robbins House started its journey. So when the house was built in 1823, and we're going to talk a little bit about the owners of the home in a few minutes, when the home was built in 1823, it was actually in the space on the right side of the slide. So this is an area of Concord known as the Great Field. It overlooks the Concord River, and it's in an area that Concordians in the Robbins and Garrison lifetime would have referred to as the Great Meadows, which was a really well-known agricultural area of Concord. So when it was built in 1823, it was really built at least a half mile from any town road. So it was really built in a very sort of peripheral, really marginalized community in the time period. Today, this area of the Great Field is actually where the town of Concord has put its wastewater treatment plant. So even though Concord was aware of the history of the neighborhood in the 1980s, the wastewater treatment plant was put in the Great Field. So it kind of gives you that sense, once again, of that issue of erasure, like the idea of, prominent kind of spaces, landscapes of Black history in Concord, and yet we're competing in that story, with the wastewater treatment plant. In 1823, when the house was built, this area of the Great Field was home to a marginalized community of Native American and African American families who literally lived on the periphery of Concord society. They were attempting to eke out a modicum of social mobility and independence through odd jobs and farming commodities like cranberries and rye. But this was one of three marginalized communities that existed in Concord in the 19th century. Eventually, what happens to the Robbins House, and we'll talk a little bit about the family members, is by the 1870s, the home was actually purchased by a real estate speculator who purchased the home. And he actually moved the home from the Great Field all the way to Bedford Street, probably in the middle of the winter on ice, pulled by oxen, several teams of oxen, down to Bedford Street. And it ended up for decades, actually kind of across the street from Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in downtown Concord. And it was the home of an Irish immigrant family. The last owner was a person of Scottish descent, but it was actually a home all the way from 1823 to right around like 2007 or 8 when the last owner died. And what happened is in 2008, the home was actually going to be slated for demolition. It was slated for demolition. Someone had purchased the property. They wanted to take down the house and build a larger home on the land that they had purchased. And that's when members of the Historical Commission, some Black family members in the community, really came together to work in a grassroots effort to save the home, because anecdotally, the house had always been known as a home that had been occupied by Black Concordians. It actually had a plaque on it that said Peter Hutchinson when it was in 2008, and Peter Hutchinson was the last African-American owner of the home in the 1860s. So people were kind of aware of the history of the house, and so efforts were made to preserve it. So in 2010, an organization called the Drinking Gourd Project, that eventually became the Robbins House, Inc., was created specifically to preserve the house, to really create a space where stories of Black Concordians could be told. And then it was moved in 2011. So we're actually celebrating the 15th anniversary of our move this May of 2011. It was moved from Bedford Street on a flatbed truck to its current location at 320 Monument Street in the Minuteman National Park. So really, without a lot of grassroots support, this house, might have been destroyed, and the history that we've uncovered since then might have been lost, particularly the story of Ellen Garrison. So it's a really amazing story of, grassroots, effort to really reclaim this history that was on the precipice of being lost at the time. So what we do in the Robbins House is we have these bio boards. So these bio boards are in the house, and they reflect the stories of some of the family members who lived in the home. So I just want to talk a little bit about what some of the individuals, and then we'll start talking a little bit more about Ellen Garrison. So one of the first individuals that we associate and connect to the Robbins House was actually Caesar Robbins. We consider Caesar Robbins the patriarch of the Robbins family. He was enslaved at birth in Chelmsford, and as a young man, he served in 2 world wars. So he served as a teenager in the French and Indian War. We have actually we found his muster roll where his enslaver is listed as John Robbins, and he also serves as a patriot of color during the American Revolution. And we know that by the time of the Revolution, he was living in Acton. His enslaver was Israel Heald, who actually was the officer of a militia from Acton, who we know fought at the North Bridge on April 19th, 1775. So we assume, even though people of color were prohibited from being officially in the militia, Caesar Robbins and about 40 to 50 other persons of color probably were at the Battle of Lexington and Concord on April 19th. So we know that he participated in campaigns around Dorchester Heights, around Fort Ticonderoga, and then he probably became self-emancipated from his service in the Revolution. And by the 1790s, he had settled in Concord, out in the Great Field. And he probably had a home that was not the Robbins House, but a home out in the Great Field where he was living with his wife, several of his children. He had 6 kids. And we think, at least originally, the idea is that the Robbins House was probably originally intended potentially for Caesar Robbins, but unfortunately he dies in 1822, and the home is completed in 1823. So we suspect, we don't know for certain, that he probably intended to live in the Robbins House, but he dies before the home is complete. So what happens next is his son, and all of his children were born free. His son Peter actually purchases the house. So he purchases a small farm of 13 acres and the new house, right? That would be the Robbins House, in 1823 in the spring for about $260. And we know that he had a mortgage. He became a farmer, so he grew cranberries and rye out in the Great Field. But interestingly enough, the deed of the house very specifically split the house into 2 parts where 2 families would live. So Peter and his wife Fatima, they had no children, would live on the west side of the house, and Peter's sister Susan and her husband Jack Garrison, with their children, would live on the east side of the house. So in 1823, when the deed was created, it was created as a dual family home. So some of Caesar's children, right? Peter Robbins, Susan Nee Robbins Garrison, they end up sharing this house. So it becomes a family home in the time period. And the other thing I wanted to mention about the bio boards before I talk a little bit about Ellen's parents is that these bio boards, we use primarily representational images. So we don't know for the most part what members of the Robbins and Garrison family members look like, with 2 exceptions that I'll talk about in a little while. And so we use these images. They were created before I became the executive director of the Robbins House. And the museum made the decision at the time that they wanted sort of a face to go along with the story found within the bio boards. So they used representational images from the Library of Congress. We've discussed as a museum, particularly in the last couple of years, of moving away from the bio boards and actually talking about creating silhouettes, particularly for those family members, including Ellen, that we don't know exactly what they look like. So that's a discussion that's kind of ongoing within the museum. But in the next probably year or so, we'll have officially moved to silhouettes. So like I said, right, this is a dual family home when it was built in 1823. So the people that I want to talk about now are Ellen's parents, so Ellen Garrison's parents. So Susan and Jack Garrison occupied the east side of the house. And Susan grew up, in Concord, spent most of her life in Concord. In 1812, she married Jack Garrison, and Jack Garrison was a self-emancipated man from New Jersey. So we know that Susan, Jack, and their surviving children occupied the eastern half of the Robbins House from 1823 into the 1830s. So they had 9 children altogether. They lose 5 of the children relatively young. 4 of their children survived to adulthood. And like I said, when Peter Robbins purchased the Robbins House in 1823, the deed, which we have a copy of, specifically stipulated that the eastern half of the house would be used for the Garrison family. We don't know why. We don't know what the motivation for the dual family home was, but it kind of implies a closeness, certainly, between Peter Robbins and Susan Garrison. Susan Garrison was clearly an inspiration for both of her daughters, Ellen and her older sister, Susan. Susan Garrison is sort of this fascinating woman in her own right, but she most likely did not learn to read and write, but she insisted and supported her children's public school education in town. So all of her surviving children were attended Concord Public Schools. They were considered good students. So there's anecdotal information in some antiquarian sources that we have that they were considered good scholars. Ellen, often took like the first prize home in her class. And Susan herself definitely supported the growing anti-slavery movement in Concord and beyond. So we know that Susan joined the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society at its founding in the fall of 1837. And she was the only Black female who was a founding member of the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society. 2 months after the founding, we know that Susan hosted one of the society's meetings in her home on Monument Street. And along with other Concord female anti-slavery members, we know that throughout the 1830s, Susan Garrison signed several petitions as a way to make her voice heard in a time when women couldn't vote. So she signed petitions calling for an end to slavery in the District of Columbia, for an end to the slave trade. She opposed the annexation of Texas, and she signed a petition along with her daughters, Susan and Ellen Garrison, denouncing the removal of Cherokee Native Americans from Georgia in the time period as well. So she was definitely very active politically in this time period, as a lot of the women in Concord were. So a lot of the women were actually ahead of the curve. We think of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Thoreau as really being, huge proponents of the anti-slavery movement, but it's actually the women of Concord who actually take a lot of the first steps in promoting the anti-slavery and abolitionist movements in the time period. And Susan Garrison was definitely part of that. The last thing that I wanted to mention about Jack Garrison is that, like I said, we use these representational images for the most part, but we actually have two photographs of Garrison family members. So we have a photograph of Ellen's brother, John, and her father, Jack Garrison. So the image on the bio board on the right is actually an image of Ellen's father. It was taken probably around 1860 when he was the oldest person in town, so the oldest person in Concord. And someone paid for him to go into Concord, into Boston from Concord on the train to Summer Street. He, he's wearing his work apron. He was clearly proud of the work that he did as a laborer. And he was given that walking stick as the oldest person in town. So this image and the walking stick itself is actually part of the collection of the Concord Museum today. So we do have some visual artifacts of the Garrison family, even though really the only artifact that we have is the house itself as well. So let me talk a little bit about the individual that we consider kind of the star of the family, and that's Susan and Jack's daughter, Ellen Garrison. So interestingly enough, when the Robbins House was created as a museum in 2011, we really didn't know a lot about Ellen Garrison. The home was saved primarily because of the fact that it had been the home of Peter Hutchinson. People suspected it was Caesar Robbins' home, but they really didn't know much about some of the female occupants of the home in the time period. But because of a lot of research, a lot of genealogical work, Ellen's story has really come to the forefront. And she is really considered kind of the star of the Robbins House. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about her life and times as well. So Ellen Garrison was born in April of 1823. So she's as old as the house. We know that the Robbins and Garrison family members moved in the spring of 1823. So whether she was born in the house or raised from birth is a bone of contention with some of the historians of the Robbins house. But either way, she spent her from birth, to her teens, living in the Robbins house. And she was actually born on April 14th, 1823. So we're talking about her on the 203rd anniversary of her birthday. So that's kind of a nice touch for tonight. And Ellen really came of age during a time when the rights of African Americans became a topic of both local and national importance. For Concord, the late 1830s were especially pivotal years. Debates at the Concord Lyceum included discussions about racial superiority, and influential abolitionists, like Frederick Douglass, visited the town to give anti-slavery lectures. And following one such visit by Angelina and Sarah Grimke, local women founded the Ladies Anti-Slavery Society of Concord. So, the women of Concord, including Ellen, were clearly influenced by these sort of national issues that were being debated so vehemently around the country in this time period. So in 1835, we have our first sort of primary source that talks a little bit about Ellen Garrison's sort of courage and activism as well. So this is actually on the left-hand side, the first primary source that really tells Ellen Garrison's story. So in 1835, Ellen was 12 years old. And in 1835, Concord was celebrating its bicentennial. So there was a big bicentennial parade in the community. Ralph Waldo Emerson was the major person invited to walk in the parade, and local school children, including Ellen's class, were actually invited to walk as well. But initially, Ellen was very hesitant to walk in the procession. She told her teacher at the time that her mother, Susan, had forbade it because as the only Black girl in her school, she had been ill-treated on previous occasions. And she also said that besides, no one would walk with her because she was, like the only, Black child in the school of white classmates. In the end, Ellen relented. She chose to walk in the parade, and she and another little girl, Abba Prescott, walked hand in hand in the bicentennial parade beneath, quote, the gaze of curiosity, surprise, ridicule, and admiration of onlookers. And the reason why we know this story is because Abba Prescott married into the Brooks family, who were a prominent family in Concord, and Mary Merrick Brooks was actually the president of the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society. So when her daughter-in-law died young, this is one of the main stories featured in the obituary that highlights Ellen Garrison's sort of courage in integrating those white spaces in the time period, because Concord was not legally segregated, but obviously culturally and socially it was. And so Ellen had the courage, even as a young girl, to integrate those white spaces that would have been, obviously uncomfortable even for adults at the time. So this is sort of the first primary source that we have. We know that this obituary was actually eventually made into a story in an abolitionist children's magazine called The Slave's Companion. Ellen's name was changed to Alice, but her story actually kind of goes a little further than Concord in the 1830s around this idea of integrating these spaces in the time period. And before we talk a little bit about Ellen Garrison's move to Boston, I just wanted to also kind of highlight these petitions because we've talked about the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about how common these petitions were in the time period. So, like I said, in a time period when women really couldn't express their voices politically through suffrage, through the vote, petitions in the time period were a way for women to use, their signature, their name, in political ways. And so we know that the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society often signed these petitions. Like I said, Susan signed several petitions. Ellen Garrison, when she was living in Boston, signed several petitions. So these were a way for women to really sort of take the lead in the anti-slavery movement, particularly in Massachusetts at the time period. And a lot of these Massachusetts petitions were directly sent to the legislature. So it was a way for people to kind of see the kind of abolitionist spirit that existed in Massachusetts in the time period. So it's something that you can really find as a resource online. We found, several petitions with Ellen Garrison's signature, with her mother's signature, with other prominent women of the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society. So it's kind of a neat primary source to think about women's participation in the anti-slavery movement at the time. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about the fact that Ellen Garrison really moves around a lot. She moves around in a way that we don't always expect 19th century women to do. So she grew up in Concord. She received a public education in Concord. We know that eventually, around 1841, her mother, Susan, dies. And that seems to be the impetus for Ellen Garrison to move to Boston. So we know that her sister, Susan, settled in Boston as well. We don't know exactly where Ellen, what street she lived on, but we know that Susan settled near Belknap Street, which is on the north slope of Beacon Hill. So we know that they settled in a very, prominent Black community in Beacon Hill in the 1840s and 50s. And she actually Ellen probably spends about 20 years of her life living in Beacon Hill. We know that she joined a church. So she actually joined the Joy Baptist Street Church, which is where the African American Museum is in Boston now. We know that she gets married in Boston. So we know that in 1857, probably in the sanctuary that you see on the right-hand side, she married a farmer from Delaware who was self-emancipated named John Jackson. And they got married in 1857. So she was in, her early 30s. They didn't have any children. But and he actually unfortunately passes away a few years after their marriage. So we know that she definitely developed a religious, a social, and a political community in Boston at the time. We also think, although we don't have any records to completely confirm this, and that goes back to the issue of putting lives together with source material that has either been destroyed by accident, there was a fire, or just doesn't exist. But we know most likely that in the 1840s, Ellen Garrison probably began her teaching career in Boston as well. So she's definitely sort of creating a community for herself in this time period. We know as well that she also becomes involved in the anti-slavery and abolitionist movements. So we know that she, definitely becomes involved through some of her connections with the Joy Street Church, that she was definitely sort of a rising figure in some ways in the anti-slavery movement in Boston. So there's just two examples that I want to show you of her connection to the larger anti-slavery movement in the time period. So the pamphlet on the left is an advertisement for a farewell meeting that involves saying farewell to William Lloyd Garrison. Many of you probably know that William Lloyd Garrison was the founder of The Liberator, the first anti-slavery magazine in the United States. He was a very well-known abolitionist around the United States in this time period. And William Wells Brown was a self-emancipated man who became an author. He wrote a autobiography, a slave narrative that really helps to kind of transform people's opinions about slavery in Northern society in the time period. So they were going on a tour of Europe in the time period. And so there was going to be sort of a big, essentially a party, right? A presentation of William Lloyd Garrison. And if you look at the bottom, it's the committee that worked on the farewell meeting includes Ellen Garrison. So she's actually the third, she's the top line in the third row, the third column. So that kind of gives you an indication of kind of some of the work that she was doing in Boston in the time period. The other thing that she does as well is she joins a committee with people like William Painter Nell, who's a well-known Black author as well, to help create what became known as the Charles Torrey Monument. Charles Torrey was he's not well known today, but he was actually known as the father of the Underground Railroad. And it's estimated that he helped save hundreds of enslaved persons and helped to bring them to kind of freedom in the North on the Underground Railroad in the time period. He was eventually arrested in Maryland, and he ended up dying in prison. So he becomes a martyr to the abolitionist movement in the time period. And the people of Boston wanted to thank him, obviously, for his contributions to anti-slavery. So they erected this monument for him in the Mount Auburn Cemetery. It's still there today. And Ellen Garrison was one of the individuals who served on the committee that helped to, find a designer, helped to create this monument to Charles Torrey. And we know of these two events because of the Liberator. So we know that a lot of her anti-slavery activity appears in the Liberator. If you look at Ellen Garrison, if you look her up, she actually appears in kind of online search engines today. So so it's once again kind of sleuthing to try to figure out what she was doing in the time period during her time in Boston. And then eventually, Ellen Garrison decides to leave. So once again, she's right around the middle of the Civil War. She decides that she wants to move south to help educate newly freed slaves during the Civil War and in the aftermath of Reconstruction. So she decides that she's going to apply to teach newly freed people. In June of 1863, she wrote to the American Missionary Association, which was a private organization, but similar to the Freedmen Schools. It was an organization that was setting up schools throughout the South for newly freed people. They hired both Black and white, predominantly women, to teach in these schools in the time period. So in her application materials, this is what she wrote. She said, "I have a great desire to go and labor among the freedmen of the South. I think it is our duty as a people to spend our lives in trying to elevate our own race. Who can feel for us if we do not feel for ourselves? And who can feel the sympathy that we can, who are identified with them?" She also mentioned that she received a good common school education in Concord, and she mentioned that her hometown was Concord. She went on to explain that she could teach the common English branches: reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, and grammar. So she actually received a favorable response from the American Missionary Association. And in 1865, Ellen journeyed to the South. So between 1865 and 1869, so for 4 years, we know that she taught freedmen of all ages in Port Deposit, Maryland, and in Chickahominy, Virginia, although she ends up teaching in North Carolina and other places as well for the freedmen schools in this time period. We know that each summer she returned to Concord, which she always continued to refer to as her home in letters. So we know that she always came back to the area in the time period. We know about her experiences as a teacher in the South because of a series of letters that were actually discovered at Tulane University in the Amistad collection, we have about 100 of Ellen Garrison's letters. So these letters are really informative, and they really help tell us kind of the struggles and also the successes that she had as a teacher in Maryland in the time period in particular. But she does talk about the kind of racial discrimination, the white supremacy that she faced as a Black teacher in the South in the time period. She writes a lot about being pushed off the street by white residents of the area. She talks about being called the N-word, about the fact that, you know, at some point you can't really go out at night because you'll be stoned by people she referred to as rowdies. So she's definitely facing a lot of physical intimidation, physical violence, in a way that a lot of Black and white women from the North faced as teachers during Reconstruction in the South. So her experience is very typical of a lot of the women that went South to teach in the time period. The other sort of interesting thing that happens to her in the South, however, is she's living in Port Deposit, Maryland during Reconstruction when Congress is passing a series of civil rights laws through Congress to better the lives of newly freed people, but also for individuals and people of color around the United States in the time period. So in April of 1866, when she's living in Port Deposit, Maryland, Congress passes the Civil Rights Act. It was the first major civil rights legislation ever passed through Congress in the time period. It was considered the precursor to the 14th Amendment. And what the Civil Rights Act does at the time is it established that all people born in the United States are citizens, right? Some of us are still arguing about that today, right? But it says all persons, right, born in the United States are citizens. It gives, you know, enslaved people who were born in the United States citizenship. It prohibited discrimination and exercise of civil rights, and it gave citizens the right to sue in court. So it gave people of color substantial rights that didn't exist in the time period. And so we know that Ellen Garrison made a determination after the passage of the Civil Rights Act to really challenge segregation laws in the South in the time period, right? And this is a very dangerous time to do this, but she does it anyway. So we know that in May of 1866, May 5th, she and a fellow Black teacher named Mary Anderson are going to travel from Port Deposit to Baltimore, Maryland. And when they are in Baltimore, Maryland, they are going to attempt to desegregate the women's waiting room in the Baltimore train station. So in May 5th, 1866, she and Mary Anderson walk into the Baltimore train station. They sit down in the segregated whites only, right, white women only ladies waiting room, and they are thrown out by the station master. She talks about in her letters having her arm injured as a result of being thrown out of the waiting room. But rather than accepting defeat, right, she goes back the next day, gets witnesses who saw this incident, and then she hires a lawyer, right? We're not exactly sure how, but she hires a lawyer and she sues in the Maryland state court system for discrimination, right? Sort of this challenge to segregation laws in the time period. We know that ultimately her court case was thrown out, but 90 years before Rosa Parks, she's doing the exact kind of, you know, work that Rosa Parks and other civil rights activists will do in the 1950s. And she was probably one of the first, if not the first, African-American woman to challenge these segregation laws in the time period. We know from her letters that the Black community in Baltimore were very interested in this case. They gave money and support for her cause. And even though it was thrown out, it's an example of the kind of challenge to these type of deeply racist segregationist laws that existed during Reconstruction in the time period. This is an example of from a newspaper in Baltimore. So it's actually a little snippet, a clip from one of the Baltimore newspapers. But her action and Mary Anderson's action actually spread in newspapers from Baltimore. We found them in South Carolina. We found them all the way to Alabama. And we just actually recently found a German-speaking newspaper in Baltimore that also highlighted Ellen Garrison's attempt to desegregate the Baltimore train station. So clearly, people in the South were kind of looking at and seeing, what Black activists were doing in the time period as well. So in many ways, it was probably most likely a test case to combat segregation in the Reconstruction South, which is why it created a little bit of interest in the time period. Eventually, after about 10 years in North Carolina, after leaving Maryland, Ellen Garrison also decides to go west. So she actually ends up spending the 1880s after a decade in North Carolina. She teaches in several schools in North Carolina. She is part of this exodus of Black Americans to the West. So facing racial discrimination in the South, a lot of Black Americans moved west, primarily because of the promise of the Homestead Act. So they were hoping for better social mobility, for the promise of, better land opportunities, land ownership. So thousands of African Americans moved west in the late 1870s and 1880s to places like Kansas, and they were known as exodusters. So it's a biblical reference, right? So they're creating an exodus for better opportunity. So she settles in the late 1870s, early 1880s, in Barton County, Kansas, where she continues to teach. So she actually teaches at two schools in Barton County. And in 1881, she actually marries a homesteader named Harvey Clark. And he was a widower with several teenage children. So in her 50s, late 50s, she becomes the stepmother of several teenage children. And eventually, we think that what happens to Ellen Garrison is she develops probably tuberculosis or some type of respiratory illness. And a lot of people moved even further west in the time period because of the dry air of California was supposed to be better for people with respiratory illnesses. So we know that she eventually moves to the Altadena area, so Pasadena, Altadena area of California. And she dies in 1892 in December in her late 60s. So this is her death certificate on the left. And I'm going to end with this story, which is the story of the gravestones on the right. When she dies in 1892, she was buried in an unmarked grave in Mountain View Cemetery. And members of the Altadena Historical Society, led by Veronica Jones, who's the president of the Altadena Historical Society. She's this amazing, wonderful human being. She really led the effort to find Ellen Garrison's grave and to put a marker on it. So the Altadena Historical Society actually found Ellen Garrison, Clark, they found Harvey Clark, they found some of Ellen's children, stepchildren. Susan Garrison, her sister, had actually moved to Pasadena as well. So she is buried in the Altadena Mountain View Cemetery as well. So yeah, on Juneteenth, now 3 years ago, they placed these grave markers on the graves of the family members. So, her life was really bookended by being raised in Concord, getting an education in Concord, but she ends her life in Altadena. And so it's really wonderful to kind of have a sister organization that really helps to tell Ellen Garrison's story on a different coast. So it's been a wonderful experience to have that be part of the kind of success story of the Robbins House, kind of telling, this amazing woman's story through through both coasts. So I think I'll end there, but I'm happy to answer any questions. I can talk about Ellen Garrison all night, so I'm sorry that I went a little longer than I intended. But like I said, I'm very happy to answer any questions. So let me stop sharing my screen. And then there's some questions.
I'm just,
Oh, okay. So some of the questions I've already answered.
yeah. And I'm just trying to, let's see, find Katie as well. Thank you so much. This has been amazing. I feel like I learned so much. And let me find my other, oh, here we go. Okay, if anybody has any kind of question for Jen, please put it in the chat. I see someone's just saying it was very fascinating. Thank you very much. I agree with that 100%. And I feel like I had a question, but here we go. Okay, I'm just going to bring Katie Campbell back online as well. Katie, just so you know. And find me. It's always fun to do Zoom things, isn't it? Okay.
Jen, can you share when the Robbins House is open for the season so people can come and find more information?
Yes, so we're seasonal. We don't have any heat. When they moved in 2011, they made the determination not to put heat in, although we're hoping to actually put an HVAC system in this season sometime. But we're open April 20th for the whole season, which goes till October 31st. We're open 7 days a week from 10:30 to 4:30.
Wow,
Excellent.
fantastic.
Excellent.
Ooh, maybe I have a Q&A question. There we go. Yeah. Yeah, is the house now open to the public? Yep, well, you just answered that.
Yes.
And my question, but you did kind of answer it. But so there is no kind of marker or anything for where the house originally stood because it's a waste treatment plant. Is that true?
Well, it's kind of an interesting question. So, Concord, with like the help of Robbins House and some partners and collaborators, we're trying to create a Black Heritage Trail in Concord. So to really create the history within the landscape. So to kind of put signs out, like saying like, this is where, Frederick Douglass spoke. This is where the Robbins House was. This is where, Jack Garrison lived. So we're trying to create a Black Heritage Trail in Concord right now. It's kind of an ongoing process, but that's hopefully something that would eventually be where people could go and see, this is where the Robbins House actually was and things like that.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it's wonderful because there's that feeling of like wanting to know how it felt. Where were they actually
Mhm.
placed? Where you are is wonderful because you have
Right.
more exposure to the public.
Mhm. Right.
So I just asked
And I
what's,
know,
go
oh,
ahead.
excuse me.
No, go ahead. You don't.
I know your focus is on the Robbins family in particular, but
Mhm.
you mentioned that the house was originally in a community of sort of disenfranchised,
Yep.
the indigenous
Mhm.
and the uh, newly freed
Mhm.
and people of color. Do you have any sense of how big a population that was compared to Concord in general at that time?
I mean, the Black population in Concord was probably like 1 to 2% of the population. In the time period when the Robbins House existed, as a home. Um, we know some information about the people who lived out in the Great Field. It includes people like John Jack. He was the first Black man in Concord to own land in Concord. We know that there was like a Brister Freeman was a patriot of color. There's a site that the Robbins House has honored where he lived near Walden Pond, which is like another one of the marginalized communities of color in Concord at the time. So we have like a sense of some of the people that lived there, but not everyone. And interestingly enough, we actually get some of the source material from Thoreau, who wrote about those individuals in Walden, talking about, he actually mentions Caesar Robbins in Walden. He says that from recollections from his mother that a woman named Lydia Bay, like had a home right beyond Caesar's. So, so it's sort of kind of secondhand because, obviously like he didn't know these people, but his mother might have. So it kind of gives you some source material to then go back into the primary source material in the town record to try to kind of bring those stories more fuller to life.
Mm.
Mhm.
I have one question. I don't know if it's really if you can answer it, but someone has asked, what's the story behind the removal of the silhouettes on the benches on Monument Square in Concord?
Oh, that was only meant to be temporary. So last year there was I can't remember the title except that it was called like Freedom Silhouette, and it was like two benches, and the benches are oddly enough still there, and it was Ellen Garrison and Henry David Thoreau sitting opposite each other in conversation. It was a beautifully done art piece, but it was only meant to be temporary, so the silhouettes were removed. The Robbins House and Thoreau Farm are interested in potentially like taking those silhouettes and maybe adding them to our outside installations, but we haven't really gotten much further than that. So it was only meant to be temporary.
I love the what you have outside the museum is just as impactful, I think, as what you have inside. It's impactful.
Yeah, we've been trying to do a lot of like since I came on as the director, we've had like two art installations. We have a story walk at the moment. So yeah, we try to do a lot of like outside things for families and yeah, to make it a little bit more interesting for, young people to come to the museum and things like that. Yep.
Yeah, well, I love that. I think, Katie, there's no more questions, and I know we're coming up to the 8 o'clock hour for you, Jen. Katie, if you want to wrap up and oh, I have one more.
Again, I'd just like to thank Jen, as the executive director of the Robbins House for sharing her information with us tonight. Um, the prompt for this, for those of you who don't know, is that the Golden Ball Tavern Museum currently has an exhibit called Lost Liberties, Broken Promises, which focuses on those people who did not benefit from the American Revolution, and we are delighted that Jen could share this information with us. It just helps us give a richer understanding of the area. It's not Weston specific, obviously, but we can't thank you enough, Jen. We really appreciate all of this
Thank you.
information, and I encourage everybody to go to the Robbins House. It's a fascinating place with a lot of
Yeah.
things that I never knew, and now I do. So thank you very
Yeah,
much.
come visit.
And thanks to everyone for attending and to Mass Humanities and Mass Cultural Council.